Right, so today we are testing the RTX 3060 in Cyberpunk. Now let's just go over the settings here quickly. We'll be testing at 1080p, 40 to 40p, and maybe 4K depending on how it goes. Currently we're on the medium preset at 1080p. I also want to show you gameplay. I've got crowd density set to medium. So what I basically do if I select the medium preset is I just disable any upscaling. I just do it once or twice because it does sometimes not take effect, and then I disable any of these post-processing effects as well, especially motion blur. All right, so this is the first time I'm testing the RTX 3060 in Cyberpunk. I'm not sure why it took me this long, but here we go. Right, so you can see we're getting around 90 frames per second. This is just outside of V's apartment, a mega building H10. This is his first apartment that you unlock, and this is a pretty demanding scenario or scene. There's supposed to be a lot of NPCs, and you can see that our GPU usage is pretty much pegged at 99%, which means we're not CPU bottlenecked, and our CPU is a little bit toasty. Not entirely sure why. I mean, it's still fine. 80 degrees is fine, but it is a little bit hot for a 12400F. Previously I was getting around 60 to 65 degrees Celsius. Once again, not an issue as the CPU clock stays at 4 gigahertz. But all right, let's see what happens once we start driving around. All right, so you can see in the top left hand corner there we've got a bunch of metrics there. More importantly, we've got the 1% and 0.1% lows along with the frame rate and the frame time graph. Now the frame time graph will just show you the frame time consistency. So the flatter the graph, the better. And then also the 1% and 0.1% lows. The closer those are to the average, the better. Those would indicate stutter. 0.1% lows would indicate micro stutter. That'll probably still be noticeable. And 1% lows will indicate stutters that you will definitely notice. But so far we're doing pretty okay. We're getting 84 frames per second on average. Our lows are also pretty respectable. And this game has come quite a long way since its launch. Alright, so our average of 84 frames per second there. Let's see what happens on high. Right, so once again, I'm just going to select the high preset here and then just disable FSR, disable all that and all this as well, just to keep it uniform, and the rest are high settings, right? No ray tracing. And let's just reset our numbers here. So you can see we didn't lose much. We were like around 80 frames per second in this specific area. Yeah, I'm just going to go drive down there and then come back up again to see what the averages are like. But this area, yeah, it's slightly more demanding, it seems, and driving around is definitely more demanding than walking around in Cyberpunk. But you can see there's not really that big a difference between medium and high. Sure, we lost around 8 frames per second on average, which is around 10%. Not the end of the world. I'd definitely recommend you play on high if you do play at 1080p, because you're getting an above 60 frames per second experience at all times, and it looks pretty good, right? There's not that big a difference between ultra and high. We'll test the ultra preset now, and you'll see that it's probably not worth the performance hit. Alright, so we had an average of 74 frames per second, so basically a 10 frames per second loss, and not the end of the world. It still looks good, it still played well. If your aim is 60 frames per second, then 1080p high is definitely the way to go. Alright, let's see what happens on ultra. Once again, on the ultra preset, just disabling all this nonsense over here. Right, so reset our numbers and off we go. So now we lost another 10, sometimes even 20 frames per second. We're dipping below 60 frames per second here, and that's definitely not ideal. Sure, 58 frames per second. Oh, that's a big accident. 58 frames per second or 60 frames per second, not going to be the end of the world, but dipping below even 50 there, definitely not ideal. And as I said, not big a difference between high and ultra, and I personally wouldn't recommend playing at ultra unless you start using DLSS, which we would need to maintain 60 frames per second. But then again, DLSS or FSR or even XeSS at 1080p, it's just not worth it. You lose quite a lot of visual fidelity. If you do want to play with ray tracing, then obviously you'll need to use upscaling tech even at 1080p, but we're not using ray tracing, so just use the 1080p high preset. I mean, we can definitely still get some additional performance here by just tweaking the settings, but that'll take ages. This video will be 2 hours long, and you don't have time for that. All right, that's it for 1080p. Let's see what happens at 1440p. Right, we're now at 1440p, and we'll just start with the medium preset once again, just disabling all of this nonsense. Right, let's see how it goes. And we're getting almost the same frame rate as what we had at 1080p Ultra. Maybe slightly lower, but the game definitely looks a whole lot better. 1440p medium, I'd say, does look a lot better than 1080p Ultra, but this is a 32-inch monitor, so 1080p does look kind of fuzzy on here. 1440p is where it shines, and 4K. So if you've got a 1080p monitor, maybe a smaller one than this, at least a 24-inch or even 27-inch, the pixel density at 1080p would be a lot higher, so it would look a lot better than on my monitor at 1080p. Alright, so we had an average of 55 frames per second, more or less the same as on 1080p Ultra, but let's see what happens on high. Right, on the high preset, just did my usual thing here, and let's just reset our numbers. And we lost another 10 frames per second. Seems like each setting is around 10 frames per second, right? Except for going to Ultra. That's just quite a bit more demanding and just not worth it. Alright, so not seeing 50 frames per second here at all. So 1440p on the high preset, definitely not the best experience here. If you are aiming for 60 frames per second, that is. I got a lot of flack in my previous video where I said I'd aim for 60 frames per second. Some people commented that we should stop being so elitist. 30 frames per second is fine. And to that I say, if you want to play at 30 frames per second, you are more than welcome to. I personally prefer a high refresh rate experience. So anything below 60 frames per second in a game like Cyberpunk is just not for me. Alright, but we can probably get closer to that 60 frames per second with some decent DLSS settings. Alright, let's see what happens on the Ultra preset. Right, we're now on the Ultra preset, and we dropped another 10 frames per second. See, it goes even lower than that, so between 10 and 20 frames per second is pretty much the cost of going to Ultra, and just definitely not worth it in my opinion, unless you've got the headroom. High is perfectly fine, and 1440p medium is also very good looking. Right, but the input latency now becomes a lot more noticeable, especially when driving. The inputs are slightly delayed, so I mean, you try and swerve out and it's just not responding as you want it to. Alright, but if you want a 30 frames per second experience, then sure, play at 1440p Ultra. The game does look extremely good at these settings. Just personally, I wouldn't play like this. Shooting would become even a little bit more of an issue because mouse input would be much delayed. Get out of my way, this is my spot. Alright, so this was at 1440p Ultra. I'm just going to do one or two tests at 4K, and then we'll move on to ray tracing. Right, we're now on 4K, and I'm just going to start us off on the low preset without any FSR and without any of these. Don't expect a playable experience. I'm just curious to see what happens here. Actually, not terrible. 40 frames per second. Once again, getting around what we had at 1440p high / Ultra, and the game looks pretty good. I mean, even on the low preset at 4K, this game does look pretty sharp. There was an autosave there, so I'm just going to reset our numbers. That's that big dip in the frame time graph there, or big spike, whichever way you look at it. Sure, the draw distance is not the best, the lighting and the shadows are not the best on the low preset, but the clarity at 4K is just unbeatable. Once again, definitely not recommending you play at 4K with a 3060. I just wanted to give you an idea of what the game can actually do, or what this GPU can actually do in this game. And next, before we test ray tracing, I'm going to go through some of the resolutions again, but this time just with the DLSS to see if we can get that 60 frames per second at all times. Right, we're back at 1080p now on the Ultra preset. This is the only preset where we could not maintain 60 frames per second. So I'm just going to use DLSS quality to see how much we can actually gain. And then once again, just disable all of these just to keep it the same. All right, and well, all right, DLSS quality helps us quite a lot here, right? We weren't seeing 60 frames per second, and now we're getting between 80 and 90 frames per second. Let me just confirm one thing quickly. Alright, yeah, so I just wanted to confirm we are dropping below 60 frames per second quite a lot with our DLSS. Just wanted to make sure that the setting actually did take effect. Sometimes it doesn't. So let's just go DLSS quality, same settings, everything. And now we can reset our numbers. Right, so I think we should be able to maintain 60 frames per second at all times. Sure, there will be some additional artifacting because obviously we're now rendering internally at a lower resolution. But if you do want to play at ultra, sure, all the more power to you. You just have to use DLSS to maintain 60 frames per second. DLSS does look quite okay. If you really want, you can use XeSS as well. XeSS has an ultra quality setting which has a slightly higher internal resolution than DLSS, so the game would look a little bit less fuzzy and the performance gains would be slightly less, but probably still enough to get us 60 frames per second. XeSS is usable on GTX 10 series and up GPUs and Radeon 6000 series and up GPUs, and Intel Arc obviously. Alright, so DLSS got us above 60 frames per second. This is actually a pretty good showing. Alright, now before we go on to the next resolution, let's see what happens once we enable ray tracing. Alright, so what we'll do is we'll jump to the high preset, right? And that disables ray tracing. So what we'll do is we'll manually go into DLSS quality mode here, and once again just disable this. I'm just going to keep on doing that. All right, and then we'll manually enable ray tracing. I'm going to enable all the ray traced options here. Just put the lighting on medium. Right, so 1080p on the high preset with some custom RT settings. Right, let's just reset our numbers here, and that 60 frames per second is not going to happen. Now, just because this GPU can do ray tracing doesn't mean you have to use it. Some games like Control, it's not as demanding when it comes to ray tracing, and it looks spectacular with ray tracing enabled, and this GPU performs pretty admirably in that game. Admirably, that's what I wanted to say. But unfortunately in Cyberpunk, if we want to get 60 frames per second, we'll have to use a more aggressive DLSS setting, and at that point it's just kind of pointless because you do lower the overall visual fidelity of the game, and just for better lighting, which in my honest opinion I don't think it's worth it. If you want to use these ray tracing, try and keep it as close to native resolution as possible, especially at 1080p. Once we go to 1440p, sure, we can go down to around balanced and it'll still look okay, and 4K down to performance, but I wouldn't use the ultra performance at 4K or the performance mode at 1440p. Once again, that's down to personal preference. If it works out for you, then it works out for you. I'm just going through some settings that I think you might find useful. All right, so let's just see what we need to do to actually do get 60 frames per second with ray tracing enabled. So I'm going to leave the settings exactly as they are. I'm just going to go down to balanced DLSS and reset our numbers. And we gained a few frames per second. It'll still drop below 60 frames per second. So this is pretty much what we had at 1080p Ultra. Don't mind the screen tearing, that's just the stupid 4K capture card. It is an Elgato 4K Pro MK2 whatever, but it doesn't have a variable refresh rate, so there's a lot of scan lines and screen tearing. Right, so all in all, this is not a terrible experience. We are getting above 60 frames per second a lot of the times, but it also drops below 60 a lot of the times. And our lows aren't really that great, our 0.1% lows. So when it comes to ray tracing, I just don't think it's worth it in this game if you've got an RTX 3060. Alright, now let's move over to 1440p and do more or less the same. Right, we're now back at 1440p and on the high preset, once again just doing my thing here. And if you can remember, we weren't able to hit 60 frames per second at these settings, right? So we're getting around 45 to 50 frames per second. So let's just see what DLSS setting we need to use to get to 60 frames per second. So I'm just going to, right off the bat, go to DLSS Balanced. As I said, DLSS Balanced still looks pretty okay at 1440p. And look at that, we've got 80 frames per second. Let me just test DLSS quality here. Let's see if that gives us 60 frames per second. It actually might. Right, off we go. I mean, this is a pretty decent start. Getting around 70 frames per second, DLSS quality, so it's a much higher internal resolution than balanced, and if we can maintain 60 frames per second, it'll be a win. Right, so far nowhere has it dropped below 60 frames per second. I'm not saying it won't ever drop below 60 frames per second when there are a lot of intense gunfights, it might, but so far I mean, this is a pretty demanding area where I'm driving, and if it doesn't happen here, it might not even happen, or if it does happen, it might not be that frequent. Right, so at 1440p, I think the high preset with DLSS set to quality is your best bet. Alright, so let's see what settings we need to enable to get ray tracing at a playable frame rate at 1440p. I'm going to leave the exact same settings we have now, just going to enable ray tracing the same as what I did previously. Let's just see, we had like 65 frames per second average, right? Now getting 35. Right, so that's not going to cut it. Quality, let's try balanced and see 43. Right, this might not even happen, right? If we go to ultra performance, let's just see. Right, ultra performance, it is. We will probably still drop below 60 frames per second. You can see we were into the lower 60s there. Maybe it keeps up the same as 1440p high on DLSS quality, but I do think with the additional strain of ray tracing, we will drop below 60. Right there we did. So unfortunately, the game looks terrible on ultra performance at 1440p, not maintaining that 60 frames per second. So that's where we're going to leave this test. I'm not going to test any further. All right, so let's move on to 4K and without ray tracing first, and see what we need to do to get 60 frames per second. All right, so we're now at 4K. Let's start off on the low preset. Once again, just I just want to get a number where we were. So let's just disable all that. Ray tracing is still disabled, and I'm getting around 40 frames per second, right? The lighting just looks terrible on low, but let's see on the low preset what we need to do to get 60 frames per second. I think let's start off with DLSS Balanced, and we are at 60 frames per second. We will probably drop below it. So far so good though. So maybe if you do have a 4K monitor and an RTX 3060 and you do want to play Cyberpunk at 60 frames per second, then you definitely can. This looks pretty okay. I mean, it definitely keeps up better than 1440p with ray tracing, so not a bad experience this at all. Sure, the game is not going to look spectacular, but it definitely doesn't look bad. And as I said, at 4K you can go down as low as DLSS performance without it being that noticeable. Sure, you'll see it if you pixel peep, but it does look pretty okay at these settings, right? And there we have it, 60 frames per second at 4K. Alright, so one more test. Let's see how this card fares with ray tracing at 4K. Right, so I'm going to leave the settings exactly as they are on the low preset, except I'm going to immediately go to DLSS Ultra Performance, and then we'll enable ray tracing. Once again, all the options, you can play around with these options to optimize your frame rate. Reflections actually make quite a big difference. Shadows, I'm not really that big a fan of shadows, but they do look a lot more accurate. All right, let's just see 4K low DLSS Ultra Performance, R2 medium, and we're getting 46 frames per second. I mean, it looks like a pretty solid 45 frames per second. Not a lot of dipping there. So, I mean, this is definitely not terrible. 4K ray tracing, I mean, sure, we're using a very aggressive upscaling setting, but not as bad as I thought. I was expecting maybe 30s, but I'm quite surprised here. Right, I'm looking to be testing too much, wasting too much time here. I just want to do one last test, and this is with the path tracing feature update. We'll go down to 1080p again, and let's just see if we can actually get playable frame rates when path tracing is enabled. All right, let's start off on the low preset again. Let me just get rid of this, and I'm going to enable DLSS Ultra Performance. You'll see why in a minute, and then we'll just manually enable path tracing here. So this is just that setting over there. All these settings will disappear once we hit apply. And I'm not going to use the path tracing preset because it changes a lot of the advanced settings as well. So pretty much the lowest settings we can go for at 1080p with the highest method of upscaling, path tracing enabled, and let's see if we can get 60 frames per second. 60 frames per second it is if we are standing still. Just look at the lighting there, the garage door. Like, you have to make the decision whether it's worth it. I mean, we are effectively playing at 480p and then upscaling to 1080p. Sure, the lighting will look good, but I mean, will you really see the lighting if it's as pixelated and blurry as it is? I mean, the rain, this just looks terrible, right? And the flickering, all the detail missing in the fences. The reflections are supposed to look great and be accurate, but it's so pixelated that you can't really see the reflections either. So definitely not worth it. If you have to use such an aggressive upscaling setting, then just lower your other visual details because it just looks terrible. All right, so that's the RTX 3060 in Cyberpunk. I tried to test as many settings as I possibly could. Obviously, we can still optimize, as I said, by manually changing different settings. But that's going to be it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.